Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1. Thank you, Sierra. We do have somebody else on here that right now posting information about where you can find this webinar as well as other webinars. She's posting the links there. They're on our website. They're archived on our website. And I do believe you get some to be sent to you. Okay, but the information is there in the chat box. And also, if you have any questions, like technical related questions or more questions about the availability of the webinars, you can ask Sierra there in the chat box. Anything that's non-content related. Okay. So this is the, let me just, one more quick thing before we get started. Questions, I'll have a question and answer session at the end. But if you do have questions along the way, you can jot them down or you can type them in the question and answer box. That's fine, so you don't forget them, but I won't get to them until the end. Okay, so the chapter 1. The chapter 1 is usually the introduction to the dissertation, and our what we work from is based on kind of 5-chapter traditional structure for the dissertation, where chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is the lit review, chapter 3 is the methods, chapter 4 is the presentation of the results, and chapter 5 is the discussion. That's a pretty standard model. Some schools do have some slight differences at that. They may have additional chapters where, like, maybe the chapter 5 is split. But the content should all, is pretty much the same. Sometimes, like I said, some schools, sometimes international schools will have slightly different structures for the dissertation. But this is pretty standard, the 5-chapter model. Okay, so chapter 1 is the introduction. And think about the introduction as it's kind of like the blueprint for your study, right? It's going to answer some of the big questions, and those being the what, the why, and the how, right? So the what of your study is the topic, right? What is it about, right? What is the topic? Chapter 1 is going to cover that. It's also going to cover the why, which is, why is it important to conduct your study? Why is it needed? Why will it be valuable? Why will the information that it gives you be valuable? The why is real important, because if you just have the what and the how without the why, you don't really have a study, right? If there's no good reason to conduct your study, then you kind of don't really have one, right? So the why is really drives the study, and we'll get to this more about these in a minute. And the how, the chapter 1's going to partially answer the how, like how is your study going to be conducted? In other words, the methods. Chapter 3 is usually the chapter that the methods is really worked out in detail, very specific about what you're going to do and how and who it's going to involve, the population sample, your methods. But chapter 1 usually has some of that in it, at least refers to, kind of alludes to it. So with the chapter 1 is going to give your reader, when they're done, a good sense of what you're doing, why you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. So that's why it kind of acts like a blueprint, right? It's kind of a map or a blueprint of what's going to be done. Okay, here's what we're going to concentrate on today. These are the components of the chapter 1. And again, they're fairly typical, right? This is a general template. And you're going to hear me say this several times throughout the presentation, but always get your school's template or guidelines for the dissertation, right? That is what you want to follow. That is what your chairs and your committee will hold you to. If they give you a template, or if the school has a template, that's what they want you to go by. Now, having said that, our template will act as a good kind of general guide. And there's a lot of commonalities, right? But again, just some schools have some particulars, they might call sections something different, or they might have some, the sections are arranged in a different order. So you always want to follow the specific guidelines. But again, what we have here will work as a good general guide. Okay. So there we go. So the introduction to the introduction. All right. So just like it's going to be the introduction to the study, obviously, but like other introductions, though, it's going to introduce your topic. It's going to introduce what you're doing. It doesn't need to be too long. It just needs to do certain things. Usually studies proceed from some kind of a problem, right? And then that gets to the why, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Why is it necessary to conduct a study? Why is it important? Okay, and usually there's some kind of problem that is the basis of the need for the study. So you want to introduce that problem, right? Usually it's a social problem or an organizational problem. If you're in education, it can be an educational problem, right? It can be declining test scores or declining grades or, teacher attrition or something. So introduce the organizational problem or the social problem, the educational problem, whatever it happens to be. Introduce it with a, if you can use statistics or some numbers to get your reader's attention, you can do that. If it's, we're losing a lot of special education teachers, well, then give it a statistic that shows that. Or you can use some kind of observation from a peer-reviewed source, right? But you want to kind of get the reader's attention about the severity of the issue, the prevalence of it. And whatever you use, a peer-reviewed source or statistics, make sure it's recent, right? Don't throw something up there, statistics from 15 years ago. I mean, the numbers are going to be different, I guarantee it. I mean, they just are. And plus you want to give a sense of what's going on now or fairly recently, right? We don't care so much of what went on 15 years ago. So make sure your whatever you use is recent. You also want to talk a little bit about, okay, so we have this problem. There's been some research done on it. Introduce your research topic and introduce your research gap as well. And we'll get to the research gap in a few minutes. But what's the research problem? Introduce the research problem early on so your reader knows. And that will help to set up why the study is needed. Here we have this gap in knowledge, or we have a research problem. Certain things are not being addressed with this problem. That's your research problem. That's why the study is needed. That needs to be included in the introduction. With the idea that the introduction is brief, probably a page, maybe a little less. And all this material will be, these things you talk about in the introduction will be elaborated upon and expanded upon and discussed later. Okay, and state what is needed to address the research problem. How your study is designed to address that research problem. So at the end of the introduction, your reader should be able to understand what you're studying and why you're studying it, and a little bit about how, maybe the kind of the general approach, whether it's a qualitative or a quantitative study, but those details can come later. And if you want, you can end the section with a preview of the sections that will follow in the chapter. So that's kind of it for the introduction. Oh, and also just to kind of note before I go farther, I encourage you to use your resources, things like this webinar, any kind of online resources you can find, any kind of school resources that your school has, the writing center at your school, but also try to get a hold of an example or a sample dissertation, approved dissertation from your school that's similar to your study, because sometimes there's just no better kind of resource when you sit down to write, where you see how other people have handled these sections. That's helpful. And sometimes your chair is happy to give you an example. You can always go into your school library and go into ProQuest. ProQuest publishes dissertations, so you can find them there too. Okay, the background follows from the introduction, and this is important because the background really kind of sets the stage for your study. It tells the reader, its purpose is to show the reader what's been conducted, what research has been conducted on your topic, and what research funnels down to what research still needs to be conducted, and that gets to your study and why your study is needed, and which will funnel into kind of the research problem, which we'll see in a minute. So you're going to have some historical material in here, right? Because we want to say a little bit about where the problem kind of originated, how the problems kind of developed over the years. And it's not just a problem, right? So if it's attrition of special education teachers, you're not just providing a background on the topic. That's part of it, or the problem. That's part of it. You also want to provide a background on the research on the topic. Right. Okay, so here's where it started. Here's how it kind of moved over the years or developed over the years, and what research has, some of the major research, obviously, you know, there may have been a lot, but some you're going to hit the highlights, right? So this is a kind of a broad strokes kind of historical treatment, right? You don't have to get into hyper specific details at this point, but you want to catch the, just think of it this way, like your reader needs to be brought up to speed of what's going on. So they need to understand where the topic has been, and they need to understand what the research on the topic has been, at least the kind of the major research, the trends in the research, right? So you want to review research on the problem to date, right? Focus on trends. So what do we know about the topic from the research, right? What are some of the big things that we know, the major things we know from the research? And this kind of funnels down. It should be getting more specific toward, you know, now that we know all this, so we have all this research on the topic, what still needs to be done? What are some of the things that we still don't know, right? And that kind of should lead into your research problem. Okay, so we have a question, and Kelly, that's a good question. I'll get to that at the end. So right, the background section, how many pages? You know, again, follow your template if you have one. Probably a few pages at least. You don't want to go on and on and on, because it is not the lit review, and we'll get there in a minute. You know, it's a broad strokes kind of historical treatment. You know, you don't get kind of bogged down into details, but it needs to be comprehensive. So again, so somebody who doesn't know, just think of like somebody who doesn't know the topic and what you're doing, they could read it and kind of get caught. They could get up to speed. So probably a few pages on the background. Transitions into the research problem, and the research problem is a much more targeted and focused discussion of what is lacking in the research, right? And that's built on, so you can get a little more specific here, right? You want to focus on perspective doesn't become so historical at this point. It's more focused on recent research. And it's, again, it's more targeted. Here's what your research problem is, but to set that up, which kind of probably comes near the end, you want to show what people have done before that. Again, it's more focused around specifically what you're doing. It's not a kind of chronological historical treatment, which is what's in the background. So it's more targeted overview of recent research on your topic to highlight what's not there, what we still need in the research, right? It specifically states what the research problem is, and specifically states that your study is designed to address that research problem. Now, before we go further, what is a research problem? And I pose that because it's one of these things that people, you know, may think they know what it is, and then when you ask them, they kind of. So let's just kind of go over it. The research problem is just like it sounds. It's a problem or an issue in the research, right? So and a gap, let's say, for example, a gap in knowledge. That's a kind of a research problem. Okay, there's different kinds of research problems. That's one kind. So research problem, it can be, let's say we have a topic and we have a lot of one type of research on that topic. Like we've got a lot of qualitative research, right? A lot of interviews and qualitative. So a lot of in-depth experience, people's in-depth perceptions and their experiences, but we don't have much quantitative research. We don't have much research that can really speak to the relationship, the statistical relationship between constructs. Okay, that might be a kind of a research problem, or it could be the reverse. We have a lot of quantitative data on something, a lot of statistics on something, but we don't really have any information or very much about how people feel about it, or their kind of experiences with it. So we need more qualitative research. That's a kind of a research problem. Maybe there's a topic we haven't approached a certain topic using a certain theory, right? And that theory might be important because it can give us some unique information. That's a kind of a research problem. So anything like that, anything that's kind of contentious or missing in the research could be a potential research problem. If your research problem is a gap, like we just don't have much knowledge on this topic in the literature, that's fine. Just double check and make sure it's a gap, because it seems to me some people like go for the gap research problem because it seems to be easy. Oh, we don't have much research in this area. Okay, but if you say that, you better be able to to show that there's not much research in this area. And how do you develop a research problem like dissection if your research problem is a gap, right? Because that seems to be kind of a challenge, right? Because a gap, by definition, is something that doesn't exist, right? It's the absence of something. So if your research problem is a gap, think about a donut and the donut hole, right? So it's hard to explain the donut hole because there's nothing there, right? How do you describe something that's not there? It's like the gap in the research. So what you do is you describe the donut, and the donut would be the research that we do have on the topic. And when you kind of describe that and talk about the research that is out there on the topic, it helps frame what's not there. And then when you come out and say, hey, we don't have research on this, it's more convincing because you've already shown, hey, we have research on this, and this on the topic, but not on what I'm doing. So it helps you to frame and kind of put forward that that research problem if it's a gap. All right, how long is this section? Again, follow your template. I mean, I've seen them, less than a page. I've seen them go a couple pages, but the research problem section shouldn't go on and on, right? It should be pretty focused. And if you find yourself writing page after page, you might want to stop and think, you may be, lacking focus. Okay, the purpose section. The purpose section is usually pretty brief. Usually this is under a page. Sometimes it's a paragraph. It contains the purpose statement, right? And usually the purpose statement is the first sentence of the purpose section. And the purpose statement has a very specific wording. I want to draw your attention to that. So it should read something like, the purpose of this, you should have the approach, the design, study is to, whatever verb you're going to have, examine, explore, the variables or concepts that are specific to your study in whatever sample setting is specific to your study. So I have a couple examples here. Quantitative example. The purpose of this quantitative correlational, that quantitative would be your approach, correlational would be your design. Study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence and then you would just add your sample, if it's middle level managers and whatever your setting is that's specific to your study. The qualitative example is very similar. The only real difference is the verb. The purpose of this generic qualitative study, so you have approach design, is to explore the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents in whatever your setting would be. So the verb examine, explore, not real important, but typically quantitative studies, they're examining something, investigating, usually verbs like that are good there. Qualitative studies typically tend to be more exploratory, so explore is a good verb there. But this is the structure of the purpose statement, right? And it's usually very specific, something like this. So you want to use a pattern like this. Again, it's the first sentence of the purpose section. And then the rest of the section, look at your template, but usually include specific information about your variables, what your variables are, your major concepts, if it's qualitative, or maybe even your instruments, you're going to talk a little bit about the instruments you're going to use to measure these variables. So it has a little additional information in it. And the other thing that I want to bring your attention to about the purpose statement itself, if you do need to, or when you do later in your study, if you need to, if you're going to talk about your purpose statement somewhere, the purpose of the study is, if you need to put that anywhere else in your study, you need to use it verbatim, right? Because your purpose of your study doesn't change. Unless you go through it later and it needs to change, you need to tweak it or something. But once it's nailed down, and if your chair is good with it, your purpose should stay like it is, right? It doesn't change. Your purpose of your study remains the same. So it's always, when you need to mention it throughout the study, use it verbatim. And that is one of the only times you got to pass on that. Your research questions are also the same way. If you need to refer to your research questions again in the study somewhere, they should stay the same. And just use them verbatim. Those two things don't change. But that is the only time you got to pass on using material from one place in your study to another place in your study verbatim. You can't do that with other material. In fact, the professors frown on that. But in this case, you can. All right. The research questions usually go here. This is not a method seminar, so I'm not going to go into any kind of depth on how to develop research questions. We do offer methods, seminars, and seminars on research questions development, I think, or they might be covered in the method seminars. So if you're interested in the more kind of nuts and bolts about how to develop research questions, check out one of those. All right, but as you know, these are really what guide your study, right? And just another point here, when your reviewers, your chair talk about alignment, obviously, everything in your study needs to align, but the real spine, the real things that really need to align are the research questions, the purpose statement, and the research problem, right? So you have a research problem. You develop these research questions to get the information that you need to address the research problem. What you're going to do then is encapsulated in a statement, which is called your purpose statement. So those three things, those are kind of like the spine of the study. And then obviously, the rest of the details need to fit too, but make sure those things align. Okay, theoretical framework usually comes next. Let's talk a little bit about what a theoretical framework is first, then we'll talk a little bit about the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to handle the section. theoretical framework. Well, let me do number 2 first, and then we'll go to the first one. What's the difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework? There's articles on this. If you really want to dig into it, you can, but I really take kind of a practical approach to it. Practical as far as, getting what you need to down on paper and getting it submitted and getting it through. And in our experience, theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. So I'll talk about each one a little bit. So the theoretical framework, typically associated with quantitative studies. And this is because quantitative studies are usually, they're measuring something. They're measuring constructs, or they're measuring, factors or variables. And usually there are theories that explain these factors, and especially there are theories for the instruments that you're going to use to measure these factors. So, because the instruments are derived from theories, right? The instruments just don't come from nowhere. So let's take an example, which is probably the easiest thing to do. Let's say you're going to study emotional intelligence. It's one of the, let's say emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. You're going to study if these two things are related. So to measure emotional intelligence, you need to find a scale or an instrument for emotional intelligence. Now, there are several, right? You're going to choose the one that most closely aligns to with what you're doing or to what you want to find out. Let's say it's Goleman's. You're going to use Goleman's instrument, and he's somebody who was instrumental in kind of popularizing emotional intelligence. So you're going to use Goleman's instrument. All right. So Goleman's instrument measures certain components of emotional intelligence. It has a certain kind of definition of emotional intelligence. So your framework, you're going to want to use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence, right? That's going to be part of your theoretical framework. And you're going to use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence, right? And Goleman's components in your theoretical framework, because that's the instrument that you're using. See the connection there? So in other words, you don't want to use Goleman's instrument and then use Smith's theory, because there will be differences, right? There are going to be differences. They're going to be, Smith may have different components as his theory than Goleman does. Then your instrument is not going to be aligned with Smith, right? Because he has different components. So make sure that the instrument that you're using, the theory, the foundational theory, and the theorist match up. Okay, so you use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence. So what you want to do is define the theory, right? Talk a little bit about why Goleman, developed the theory, and theories are designed to explain things. So talk a little bit about, why he developed the theory, what he developed to explain, and don't just say emotional intelligence. You got to kind of be more specific than that. You kind of have to break it down. Talk about any components in your theoretical framework that is part of emotional intelligence. I think it does have components. You're going to want to talk about those components and define those, right? You don't want to talk a little bit about what researchers have used the theory for, other researchers have used it for. And then a little bit about how it connects to your study. All right, so if there's a component, a certain component of emotional intelligence, managing emotions or something, you're going to have to talk a little bit about how that component relates to what you're doing. Okay, so that would be part of your theoretical framework if you were, let's say you're doing a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. That would be part of your framework, the theory of emotional intelligence. And what would be the other part? A theory of transformational leadership, right? And so together, those two theories would comprise your theoretical framework. And the same kind of idea, whoever's survey or instrument you're using for transformational leadership, make sure you use that person's, theory or theoretical foundations for your theoretical framework. So so-and-so's theory of transformational leadership will serve as the second part of the framework or the other part of the framework, and then do the same thing, define it, including any components, talk about who developed it, why they developed it, how researchers used it, and then connect the components to your theory. I'm sorry, to your study. And that's an example of what your theoretical framework would be if you're doing a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. It would have those two theories, and together those two theories would be your theoretical framework. Conceptual framework, similar idea, but you're not using surveys, right? Usually you're interviewing people. I mean, there's focus groups and things, but you're not using tools, right? Instruments. So what do? Well, sometimes there's not theories. Qualitative studies tend to be exploratory. There may not be a theory that really works. In that sense, you use the major concepts of what you're doing, right? Major concepts from the literature on your topic. So it wouldn't be, you don't have a construct, per se, like emotional intelligence. So whatever concept kind of encapsulates what you're looking at, you would do the same thing, but instead of using a theory, you just use that major concept. You pull it from the literature, you kind of define it, unpack it, and relate it to your study. And with the conceptual framework, it also has the, in qualitative studies, the conceptual framework also guides your interview questions. So when you get to the point when you have to draft your interview questions, you don't just kind of pull them out of thin air or just from your own knowledge. The framework helps guide your questions. All right. Okay. Well, so you have a question about that too, which I'll come back to. All right. So how long does the theoretical or conceptual framework need to be? It just depends. Again, follow your template. Probably a couple pages at least. Again, it's not a section you want to go on and on about, but it needs to be developed. 2 pages, a few pages. And in some, again, check your template. I'm always going to say that. But in some schools, you may just kind of talk a little bit about the theoretical framework in chapter 1 and then expound on it in chapter 2. That's fairly typical. Some schools, the theoretical framework only appears in chapter 1 and it doesn't appear in chapter 2, or vice versa. It only appears in 2 and not in 1. But most of the time, a kind of an introduction to the theoretical framework appears in chapter 1, and then a more kind of expanded version appears in chapter 2. Okay. Nature of the study or study design usually goes here. Again, this is not a methods seminar, so I'm not going to go in depth about it, but usually includes the rationale for the selection of your design, like why did you select a correlational study, right? Which is designed to examine the relationship between variables. You're going to want to talk about, why'd you choose this design? Because again, these are all decisions, right? They're just not, they're not kind of, random, like, I just thought it would be cool to do this. So they all have to be kind of supported, right? These decisions you make. We'll also probably include some information about your methodology, like who you're going to collect data from, how you're going to collect data, how you're going to analyze the data. Again, all this stuff is worked out much more in chapter 3, much more detail. But sometimes there's a section in chapter 1 where they want you to talk a little bit about it, kind of introduce it. And again, things like this are addressed in methods seminars and other, methods webinars. Webinar. So if you're interested in more help with like this section or kind of the study design in general, nature of the study, check on some of our methods webinars. Okay, definition section. this is where it's a section that's just like it sounds. You're defining important major concepts, major words, key terms in your study. And that's really all the section involves. I mean, if you want to have a little kind of introduction to the section, a narrative introduction, it can be one sentence. It can just say, the following terms are defined for use in the study, period. And then go on to your definitions. Definitions should be sequenced alphabetically. Okay, don't just put them down randomly, sequence them alphabetically. And again, yeah, these are the variables you're going to use, your factors, major concepts, important terms, important concepts in your study. I say definition should be in the form of sentences. That's not a hard and fast rule. I just do it because sometimes people want them in sentences, your chair or the template. Again, see what your template says. And if you have them as fragments, they'll say go back and change them. So I just write them in the form of sentences the first time around. Definitions should be clear and succinct. And that's because they're definitions, right? They're not discussions. Sometimes I see folks say, well, Smith defined emotional intelligence this way, but then somebody else defines it. It's a really tough term to define because there's no consensus. And it's like, no, stop. This is not a discussion, right? You want to define this term, this concept, for how you're going to be using it in your study, right? And that's what this is all about, right? Defining these terms for what they mean in your study. So that means there should absolutely never, under any circumstances, be definitions from a dictionary, okay? Because it's too general. The definitions need to come from the literature. They need to be, they need to reflect what these words and these terms and these concepts mean in your study. So they should come from the literature, right? And they should be supported with a peer-reviewed source. Sources should be recent when possible. Throughout the chapter 1, yes, generally. In the definition section, not so much. I wouldn't worry about that one so much in this section. And even the background section, of course, you're going to have some historical material, but the other section, especially in the research problem, things should be recent. Your sources should be recent. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one is that, things that happened 20 years ago, unless they're really foundational, probably aren't, that important, the research. We want like a current state of what's going on, right? What is the current state of whatever you're studying, right? That's what's going to make it relevant. Also, because of that, I see it all the time. People have old sources. And what's the first thing the chair asks them to do? Update your sources. And sometimes it's not a big deal. Sometimes it's a real pain in the neck. So always start, just as recent as using recent sources rather than older sources. Again, unless something is very foundational and you need to include it. So that's the definition section. These definitions, probably a sentence in length, maybe 2 sentences at the most. I mean, there's really no, if you have a clear and succinct definition, there's really no reason to go on more than that. And just put them in I just use very kind of straight language, like emotional intelligence will refer to, or emotional intelligence is defined as, and then just have the definition. Okay, significance. Professors like to call this section the so what section. So you're doing a study on special education teachers leaving the profession. So what? And by that, they're not being glib. They're just, the idea is, why does it matter, right? Why is it important? Why is it valuable? What's the significance? What are the implications? Who is it going to benefit? How? How's it going to benefit or contribute to the literature? So yeah, usually this section has kind of two prongs. And one is, the implications or the significance to research. The other is to practice. right? So the first one, you're kind of forecasting, right? Because you're not sure what you're going to get, but how can this, your study or information from your study, how might it add to the research? How might it contribute to what we know or how we approach a subject, right? How might it contribute to, if you're using a theory, how might it contribute to our understanding of the theory, our application of the theory, right? So you need to think about that and put that down in this section. To think about that, just, your study might, it might bring new kind of insights to the literature. And, maybe we need to focus on, A instead of B, or, something like that. Maybe it shifts our, our attention in the research on one thing over another. Maybe it gives us a new window or new insights on something. So how does it contribute? How might it contribute to the literature? The other part is, how might information from your study contribute to practice? How might your findings inform practice? How might it inform the people at the level of practice and whatever you're doing? How might it inform what they do? So again, if your study, let's just say it's an education study as an example, your study might yield information for teachers, right? To help them do what they do, or help them understand something, help them, understand how to approach a certain segment of students, or how to teach a certain topic. Or it might be, if it's, retaining special education teachers, that might have implications or significance for administrators, right? For who they hire, how they hire, their hiring practices, or how to keep these, the good teachers they want through professional development or incentives. So, so the two prongs: how might your study contribute to research? How might it inform people at the level of practice? And when you're talking about practice, you can kind of get nuts and bolts, to say, you need more, it's going to say we need more teachers need more professional development or something. Well, then how might that be, conveyed through, seminars or workshops? So you can kind of get nuts and bolts at the practical level. Some schools, I know Walden is one, has a third prong, and that's positive social change. But that's the only school I know that has that third prong. Positive social change is usually it's just like it sounds. How can it help enhance social change positively? And if you're talking about something like education, or sometimes people's well-being, if it's a health study, sometimes that's pretty easy, and that, helping people learn or better their lives, or increase their wellness, well-being, will contribute to, good social change. Okay, other sections, I've kind of lumped these together because some schools have them, some schools don't. Some schools have some of them, but not all of them. But they usually want you to talk about limitations. And limitations are the shortcomings or weaknesses. And again, you're not going to know what they are. This is kind of forecasting, right? Like looking forward. So what are some of the kind of anticipated limitations that you can foresee? For quantitative studies, a big limitation is always, getting an adequate sample size, right? Because if your sample size is too low, it's going to affect your certainty of your statistical analyses. So you could put that on there if you think you might have trouble, getting the number of participants you need. Something like qualitative research, researcher bias is always a potential limitation. Sometimes people are just too close to the subject. They care about it too much, or it's what they do, like they're a teacher and they're doing a teaching study. So it's a qualitative study. It's always good to put that in there. And then ways that you plan to prevent or reduce researcher bias, and there are ways to do that. So any kind of limitations that you can foresee, you want to talk about, as well as how you might kind of address those limitations should they arise. Assumptions. And for all these sections, this is another good place to get an example. because they're kind of easy to understand. But then when you get on the right, they're kind of tricky. It's like, oh, well, what are the limitations? So it's always helpful to see what somebody else has done and see if that might apply, or something similar might apply to your study. Assumptions, these are things that you don't have control over, right? Aspects of your study. So you just have to assume they're true, so your study can move forward. And one of the biggies is that you can't control people and you can't control what they say. So you just have to assume that they're going to be honest with you, right? That they're going to answer, whether it's answering questions on a survey or whether it's answering interview questions, that they're going to respond openly, honestly, and to the best of their ability. Of course, you're going to ensure them of the confidentiality and anonymity of their responses. So that should help, wanting them to be forthright and honest. But that's an example of an assumption. You just have to assume that that's going to happen because you can't control it. Scope, sometimes called delimitations, they're real similar. Basically, this is the boundaries of your study. This is what your study is going to include and exclude. So it delimits and it has the word delimitations, limitations. It gets kind of confusing. They're not the same thing. I just think of scope, right? It's scope. It's, if you look through a pair of binoculars or something, you have the part that you're looking at, right? Which would be your study. And then you have the black area outside of it, which is everything else is excluded. So just think of it that way. It's the boundaries of your study. And it's going to sound a lot like some of the material in your purpose. You're going to want to restate, your sample, your population, your sample, your setting. Again, what just the things that you're focusing on that's included in your study. And sometimes this is helpful for, like, let's just say an education study. Again, you're doing a study on parents, right? It's an education study, but like parental involvement. So sometimes it's helpful to say you're not going to focus on teachers, you're not going to focus on administrators, you're not focusing on students, you're just going to focus on the parents. So that kind of helps delimit, right? It puts the boundaries of what you're doing. All right, and then we're at the summary. And just like, summaries, all summaries and other chapters, you just want to recap the major points of the chapter. It's a good place to remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. And if you want, you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. Okay. But this is who we are. This is our contact information. So I'll just leave that up. And I have 2 questions. I'll go ahead and try to answer those. The first one is, how is the background different from the literature review? Well, if you think about the space that you have, that should help you kind of answer that question. In other words, the lit review is probably about 30 pages, right? It can be a little less, it can be a little more, but 25 to 30 pages is usually the sweet spot. The background to your chapter 1 is about, a few pages, let's just say 3 or 4. So that should tell you something right there. You can't get into the level of detail and depth in the background that you're supposed to in the lit review, right? So in the lit review, they want details about studies. So-and-so conducted a study. It was this kind of study. These were the participants. This was the analysis that they used. Here's what they found. Here's what the findings mean. There's a level of detail that goes into the chapter 2 that you don't really need in the background. Yeah, you're going to mention somebody's study and you're going to mention what they found, but it's kind of broad strokes. You don't need to kind of get into all the minutiae and the details. So that's one of it. And you're kind of creating a story. Think about it as a chronological story. So you're kind of hitting the trends and the highlights. So again, you don't have that level of detail and specificity that you're going to have in the lit review. So I hope that helps. The next one is, what if there are several concepts or constructs in the theory that you are not looking at in your study? if I'm reading this one correctly, and just correct me if I'm not right, it sounds like you're saying, can you just use parts of a theory? And the answer is yes. So let's just say, let's take an example. If you're looking at emotional intelligence, and it has 5, and I'm just using this as an example, I'm not real sure, but say it has 5 components to it. But you only are looking at 3 for whatever reason. You can just use those 3 components of the theory. You don't have to use them all if they don't apply. So I hope that answers your question. So if there's a part of a theory that, I mean, you can mention it, but if it doesn't apply or you're not using it, yeah, you don't have to include it. Yep. Okay, good. All right. Those are good questions. Any other questions? No other questions? Everybody's good with the chapter 1? Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you for attending. We do have other webinars on other chapters, on other topics. So, check our website to see what we're giving when. And yeah, thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. And I may see you again, or you may show up in another webinar, given by one of my colleagues. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Have a great day. Take care.